Yeah, welcome everybody. It's great to have you here. This is basically the Brewery Portal Masterclass. Some of you may already have seen a previous masterclass that was given by Co. So hopefully I can, live up to his legacy as well. For today, let's see. I want to teach you how to create your own recipe from scratch. So for some people, they already have a lot of experience, but there may also be quite some beginners among us, and really want them also to be able to get into the whole recipe creation scene and start sharing their beers. Followed by some do's and don'ts for the brewing. Common mistakes that are made, but also things you really should do. Recognizing common issues during brewing, because you have probably followed the Facebook group as well and see some common issues reoccurring there. So I want to give a little bit of background, what these issues are caused by, and what you should do and what we can do about them. And finally, a Q&A. The questions that were asked in the Facebook group will be answered here, as well as general questions that you have and that will arise during this meeting. Brewery Portal. I want to go very quickly through the three categories that we have. But first of all, the purpose of the portal itself. The purpose of the portal is it is a tool that was designed by MiniBrew to actually make recipe creation very easy and fast to pick up on. So that's why we have made these three different categories, as you see in the top screen: the brewery, the beers, and the community. In the brewery screen, you basically have an overview of your devices and what they are currently doing. As you can see, I have a MiniBrew right now that is in idle mode, so it is ready to start a new brew. As well as you can see, there are some tests going on, because normally kegs shouldn't end up here, but since I am also a tester for MiniBrew, that is why they are there. You have a fermentation line as well. So all the kegs that are in fermentation are shown there. Currently, I am not fermenting anything on this account, so that's why it is empty. And there's a beer in serving. So you can see from brewing to serving what your keg is doing at what moment. Then we have the beers section. This is the most important, I guess. This is where you create your recipe in the top right corner with the new beer. And you can see all the recipes that you have created right here. You can also see the status, whether it's public or draft. So whether you're uncertain or very certain of your beer, you can set it to public or to, share or unshare, to make sure that other people can also enjoy your beer. Well, that leads me to the community tab. You can see a lot of contributions by the MiniBrew community already. You see, let's say, a dry up lager from Christian. You see a Belgian blonde from Zhao. And you see also that every beer has this little color bar attached to it, as well as the characteristics that make the beer, for example, a blonde. So this is the alcohol percentage it has, the IBU, the SRM. These are all very important parameters when creating your beer, and especially choosing the beer you want to make. And you can also like them. So if people really like a certain recipe, they will grow in popularity, and more people may try that beer out because it, for example, is a very easy beer to brew or easily drinkable. In that kind of way. So let's head on to the beers section and create a new beer. I was thinking to create an American IPA today. So even though he's not the president anymore, I want to make the Trumpinator. Yeah, you can make any name you want. You can also just make an American IPA if you want to name it that way. Just use your imagination. I have seen some very cool names already in our recipe overview. Then I will be creating an American IPA. Save. And I end up at this screen. So you immediately see that I get this screen where you have all the different processes. So fermentation, the boiling, the mashing, and other parameters regarding your ingredients. What you can see at first is the recipe details. It will tell you what kind of a grind you need to use for basically grinding your malt. It is very important because if your malt, just like in the industrial beer brewing companies, they use a way finer ground malt because they use filters and can reach way higher efficiency when brewing. But the mini brew, since we cannot stir in the mash tun, we have to rely on a more coarse grind. So that is why the grind is set to this gap size. Obviously, you can always experiment, but this is what we have verified, and that is something that will always work, no matter what. Also, you see some information about water calculation in the ratio to malt, but that is something that will be calculated automatically. Then I scroll down. You see that there's some room for notes, private notes as well as public notes. So things that you should remember every time, let's say your OG or other parameters, or maybe something you stumbled upon during a brew and you want your fellow brewers to know, and you can put it in the public notes. Onto the actual recipe creation. Well, I said we want to make an American IPA. That means I selected the American IPA, so it should give us an indication now what an American IPA is like. It will only start giving that indication once I add an ingredient to the recipe, because then it gets information and it will start to process this. So for instance, I want to use Pilsner malt. You see this is already in my database, the Pilsner 2-row Belgium malt. You see there is an SRM link to it. And when you actually create this ingredient, you also link an extract potential to it, a moisture parameter as well. But these are all things you can find on the internet. But you're also free to use the ones that are already available, so you don't have to do anything anymore yourself. But if you want to become really specific, you can always create your own ingredients and customize it that way. So let's say I add 1600 grams of Pilsner malt, and you immediately see this popping up, the screen with parameters. This is exactly what an American IPA should look like. You see that the FG is, for example, very off. That is because no yeast is added yet, so it's not calculated. No hops are in, so the IBU, the parameter that stands for bitterness, is also 0. Same counts again for the ABV. There is no yeast, so you have no idea to what percentage you can go with your yeast, and therefore it's also still 0. Let's go back to the malt. So the first parameter I want to ensure is that we have a correct OG and a correct SRM. The OG is for the sugar amount that eventually will be in your wort at the end of the brewing phase. And the SRM, it basically defines the color that your beer will have. The OG, as you can see, we're still not within the limitations, so I want to add a little bit more. As you can see, I am almost there, but we still need some color as well. That's why I want to add a malt that also adds some extra to the color, maybe give some aroma as well. to also bring forth a more aromatic taste of the malt during the drinking of your beer, because just the Pilsner malt gives a little bit of a bready taste, but not so much. So the aromatic malt will enforce this. So let's say I add 100 grams, and the OG is now in line, the SRM is in line, so we're on track to make an American IPA in that way. Then again, you're always free to experiment, because people have made insane blends that taste amazing. So don't be shy to try something else out at some point. People have made black IPAs where, let's say, they would have added a lot of malt that the color would increase. These are all possibilities, but for now I want to keep it basic and simple, and just have a good fresh IPA. That is it for the ingredients regarding the malts. Normally you can add extra mashing steps as well if you're going to make a double mash. This is primarily used for beers that have a very high OG, meaning a lot of sugar, so a very high alcohol beer. Since we are limited to 2.3 kg of malt in our mash tun, that is the reason why people tend to do double mashes, to reach that higher OG that you normally can't reach with a single mash. Very important is the mashing scheme as well. To explain the mashing briefly, during the mashing you will be using the enzymes that are in the malts from origin, and you will be converting the starch from the grain into sugar. This sugar is needed for both the creation of flavors as well as the creation of alcohol in your beer. And normally, if you also want to have some remaining CO2 pressure, that is also why the sugar is used for, because you want to get some carbonation in your beer, because else it will be very flat and undrinkable. So there's two ways to get that carbonation going, but I will get to that later. The mashing scheme. The enzymes that are important for the mashing are so-called alpha and beta enzymes. I won't go into it too deeply, but essentially one of those enzymes creates a lot of sugars that are meant for the yeast to use as food, and the other ones are used to create mouthfeel. They are the larger sugars, and they are not so easy to eat by the yeast and thus be converted. So usually they will remain in your beer, and that's why they give mouthfeel. A very standard mashing scheme can be a 1 hour mash at 66 degrees, but to indicate that there really are two different enzymes that are operating during the mashing, I want to start at 62 degrees. This is the temperature where one of those enzymes is most active and will give the most conversions. So that's why I will be going for 62 degrees. Normally, after let's say 30 minutes, the most part of the conversions has been done, and you can transition to another step. Since I still want a little bit of this first enzyme to work, but also to start getting my second enzyme into working, I'm going for a 68 degrees step. Between 66 68 degrees, both enzymes are active, so you will create a very even and balanced sugar combination. So this is also oftentimes what people do. They just do a 1 hour mash on 66 to 68 degrees, because that is a very consistent mashing scheme. Let's say we are going to do this for 15 minutes. And this is also all information you can simply find on the internet. You just have to Google a mashing scheme for an American IPA, and you get so many examples of what people are doing. And you can simply pick one. But if you're afraid, you can always go for that, again, the 1 hour at 66 degrees. Let's go for 72, where the other enzyme is most active. And also let's add, let's say 30 or 20, well, 20 minutes to it for some more conversion. But I don't want all the dextrins converted to the smaller sugars as well. So that's why this step is still short. Then finally, this is called the mash out. It happens at 78 degrees, and you can do it for 5 minutes, for example. This is where the enzymes are mostly inactivated. So the enzymes are basically proteins, and they will be broken, and they cannot be restored or reformed in any way. That means the conversion of the starch to sugar stops here. That's it for the mashing. Let's head on to the boiling. Ideally, I prefer to go for a 60-minute boil, simply because this is sufficient to get enough sterilization of the wort, as well as enough time to have drop moments for the bitter hops and the aroma hops. Ideally go for 60, but you can also go towards 90, but that is personally the max amount I would go to. All the limitations of till what time you can go, you can find on our website, but after the whole meeting I will also share my presentation with you, and the link is in there as well for your reference. So let's start with the boiling. 60 minutes. The hop filter, it should still always be standard. We have been working on the bypass. It is a different kind of filter, but for now it is irrelevant because it's not finished with development yet. Then regarding the boiling. So the most important part of the boiling is sterilizing the wort, as well as creating a lot of flavor through the hops that you will add. And flavor comes in both aroma as well as the bitterness. The IBU is what defines the bitterness of your beer. So as you can see, we need to be between 40 and 70 IBU. So let's say I want to add a few hops. I simply tick this button a couple of times, and I'm going to start off with a typical hop used for American IPAs, and that is Columbus. Then again, there's a whole list on the internet of what hops are used for which type of beers, what kind of characteristics they have. So you have hops that have a very like citrus kind of flavor, or a very stone fruit kind of flavor. It's all able to be found on the internet. So Columbus, a typical bitter hop. I want to add 10 grams of this, and I want it to boil for 60 minutes. To be clear, I fill in 60 minutes here, so that means it will be boiling for 60 minutes. If I would say 0, it won't boil for 60 minutes. It would drop it at the end of the boiling. So that is for the aroma hops, typically. Moving on, Amarillo is also a hop that is frequently used for American IPAs, but it also still has a very floral flavor, which I really like about the IPAs in itself. With the IBU, we're at, let's say, halfway, as you can see here, 58, 59. So I want to add 10 gram, but I don't want any more bitterness. I want mostly the flavor. So let's say I add this for 5 minutes. For 5 minutes. And you see we're already almost at the edge of the IBU. Then I want to add some Citra. This is a typical aroma hop. Let's remove this. And I want to add 10 grams for 0 minutes. As you can see, nothing really happens with that IBU anymore, because once it has been added at the end of the boil, the extraction of bitterness will rapidly decrease. So that's why aroma hops are used at the end, because not much bitterness is coming from them, but primarily aroma. There's also other ingredient button. For now, I don't want to add any, but think of adjuncts that you can use like cardamom, orange peel, all those kind of things that are, for example, used for wit beer or triples. You can add them here as well. Again, referring to the limitations, there you can find all information what you can and cannot use. So that's it for the boiling. As you can see, the FG is still off and the ABV, but that is because we haven't added the yeast. But the IBU and the OG and SRM are both within limits. The fermentation. This is probably the most complicated part because there is a lot of stages that have to be added and shifted around. So this is the part I will go through a little bit more slowly. First of all, a bit of a basic explanation of the fermentation. It usually consists out of a primary fermentation, sometimes a secondary, and a lagering phase. During the primary fermentation, it usually lasts a couple of days. All of the sugar, well, the majority, will be converted to alcohol and other flavor compounds to basically already preserve your beer. So in most of the times, if the first few days of your fermentation go well and the yeast thrives in your beer, the chance that it gets spoiled by bacteria shouldn't be high anymore unless you're working, for example, with lactobacilli, which can create lactic acid or other kind of flavors. But normally the risk should be minimal once there's alcohol in the beer because it kills off other bacteria. So the primary fermentation, the pressure relief. So this indicates which kind of pressure relief item you should use. You can use the airlock or the blow-off. The blow-off is basically the safest solution because it gives the yeast more space to breathe. Because once a yeast is eating the sugar and producing alcohol, it will also produce CO2. And the CO2 needs to be released partially because else you're fermenting under pressure and not for every beer that is wanted. Plus, the pressure can become so high that the keg, well, it won't explode, but it would be dangerous. So that is why a airlock or blow-off is used. In this case, I go with the airlock because the OG that we have isn't very high, and the yeast that I'm going to use also is not very volatile, meaning that it will give a lot of foam during fermentation. So mine is very relaxed. It will ferment very well, but it won't give such a rapid fermentation that I get a lot of yeast coming out of my airlock. One of the most common yeasts is the US-05, used for American ales, and I will add the whole bag. We have been doing research on the amount of yeast you should add, and we have found that for some beers it does matter how much yeast you add, so it's better to add less. But overall, the overdosing of yeast that we do isn't that drastic because it's mostly during the primary fermentation and the first few days where the conversions take place. So with plenty of trip removals, you will be able to remove the excess yeast that you will use. So let's start with the primary. Normally, I always go for 25 degrees at 0 days. I do this because the system, it goes through meshing, boiling, and then cooling. It stops the cooling process at 25 degrees or higher. So this means as soon as I have added my keg to the power, it will give the instruction to add yeast and all those other things required, like an airlock and the trip container, because the fermentation then has actually started. That's why this first step I will do on 0 days, because it will trigger immediately when it reaches this temperature. But I also want another step in the primary, because this is not really a primary fermentation yet. I want to go and drop down to 21 degrees for, let's say, 4 days or 5 days. Normally, the most sugar is already converted after 3 days, 2 to 3 days, but I want to give it 5 days to simply keep the yeast going and make sure pretty much all of the convertible sugars are actually converted. Then I want to add a conditioning step. A conditioning step is basically the step where a trip removal is followed by. So only during this step a trip removal will take place. So that means if you want a very clear beer, you have to add several separate conditioning phases to actually remove your trip for several times. That's why we will be using this conditioning step and setting it to the 21 degrees, the final temperature where my primary ended, for 0 days. Simply because I use this step now as a way to remove my trip instead of actually using it as a phase to lager or something, or actually ferment. It's more like a trigger of the diffuser action. Let's see. Then I want to add a secondary. And you can do that here. As you can see, primary, secondary, conditioning phase, I want to add a secondary. And as you can see, it pops up here. I'm going to add a couple of more things because I want more trip removals and eventually a dry hop as well. So I'm going to add a conditioning step and another conditioning step for the time being. So as you can see, some things have shifted. The conditioning step, for some reason, this stays in place here. So I will simply remove this and move it up to here, 0, go back up, and then again we have the order of primary, the conditioning step, a secondary, followed by conditioning steps again. So to the secondary, MiniBrew usually maintains a secondary fermentation between 12 and 15 to 16 degrees. We have found that this gives a better balance to our beers because the yeast is still active at this point, but not so much. So it will start to develop less volatile and more balanced flavors than it normally would in the very high 21 to 25 temperatures. Let's see. I'm going for 15 degrees then for 2 days. Go, and that's it. And I also want to add some dry hop. Let's see what we're going for. I want to use some Citra, as well as I think I want to use some Amarillo. Again, the hops that I used previously, I want to see them come back also with their aromatic components again. And I use, let's say, 15 grams of each. And I want to add them during the secondary. I prefer, it always depends again on the recipe, but to have my dry up in for around 3 days. It can be 2 to 3 days. It again depends on the recipe that you're having. You can find all this information on the internet on how long dry hopping lasts for most recipes and most styles. So that's it for the secondary. Then back to the conditioning. Since I have added the 30 grams of dry hop, I need to have at least 3 trip removals. But let's see. I want to go for another one at 15 right there. I want to go for actually a lagering temperature. So this is where I cut off the whole fermentation and it just starts to cold crash and all the solids will sink to the bottom for 0 days, and let's see if I can already save it. Yes, I can. So this is the recipe we have made. No errors. Normally it will show you errors when you have added something that cannot be brewed. Let's say I've added 100 grams of hops during the boiling. That is something you cannot do. So that's something that the portal will also tell you. So as you can see, this is my version. I can share it, I can still edit it, I can create a new version to make very close comparisons, for example, switching out the yeast, and I can decide to directly brew it. That is in short the recipe creation. At the end of the session, you can also ask me some questions if there were still some things that were unclear. And now I want to head back to the presentation. Let's head on to the do's. So there are a couple of do's. Unfortunately, less do's than don'ts, but that makes it very simple. Again, I repeat, the hygiene with brewing is key. So you can never use too much like disinfectant. Obviously, take in aim that you shouldn't harm materials because it is acid that you're using as disinfectant. But always disinfect your hands, disinfect the material, make sure it's clean before you start brewing, before you start tapping. So make sure during tapping you remove your tap between tapping sessions and clean it and put it back on, because else your tap and your beer can become spoiled. Also important is the storage of ingredients. Something MiniBrew is working on is also adding a storage advice. So what to do with the ingredients once you order a brew pack, for example. The idea is that normally yeast is stored in the refrigerator at a temperature of around 7 degrees. It depends on the yeast that you're using, and the yeast always has a description on the package on what temperature it should be added to. For the hops, usually they are stored in a freezer, and they can simply be used in a frozen form. Ideally packaged in a vacuumed package. So as soon as you have air in a bag and there are hops in there, the hops will start giving off their flavor to the surrounding air. So that's why vacuuming is always best. Then the ingredient preparation, the milling and mashing. Milling, we advise to do on the day of brewing itself, or let's say the day in advance, because as soon as you start milling your malts, the enzymes, as soon as some moisture reaches it, can already start to work. And that is not what you want, because enzymes only work for so long period of time. This directly relates to the mashing in as well. The mashing in step requires you to add the water to the malt prior to the actual mashing step. You shouldn't do this the day in advance, because you will already start the mashing, and all of the enzymes, well, they won't be deactivated, but other enzymes will start working that you don't want to be working at that temperature, because you're simply not heating your liquid at that point. So that's why for mashing in, always make sure you start brewing on that same day and use your malt on that same day, and don't do it 2 days apart. That's it for the do's. Then don'ts. These are the links I mentioned to you for the limitations that you should take into account. So don't violate the system limitations. Obviously, there's always room for experimentation, and that's also something that MiniBrew encourages. But if you're uncertain about a certain ingredient, just reach out to the MiniBrew support, and we will try to give you advice if that is actually usable or not. Because we have had cases in the past where people use Irish moss, for example, and that clogged the whole machine and the base station was destroyed. So Irish moss is a no-go. because it's simply hard to control. Something can get loose, and if that ends up in the lines or in the heater or the pump, it can become broken. So make sure to keep those system limitations in mind. Then the double meshes continuously. This basically means that if you're always looking for the edges of the mini brew, so you're constantly trying to push the limits of the mini brew, eventually it will break. It's basically the same with everything. If you do something too much, so way too many double meshes, meaning very viscous liquids, the pump eventually won't be able to handle it and actually enable you to brew for the 120 specified brews beforehand, simply because you're stressing the machine so much. We are aware of this as well, and we want to support the double meshes. So we are also looking into improving our hardware to actually make the more continuously double meshing possible. Also, just a quick reminder, the interruption of updates. This is usually especially something that is giving issues with first-time users, so people that haven't got any updated hardware equipment. Just have some patience, and if you have some questions, again, reach out to our support page, see if there are any articles that help you out, and if not, you can always reach out to us. But we have seen people abort their Wi-Fi updates, for example, too often, and that gives us a lot of extra work, which shouldn't be necessary in the first place. Also, something that some people have sadly discovered is that once they had a big CO2 canister connected, so that those are not the small cartridges I'm talking about, that is a lot of CO2, and it all leaked away overnight because it was left open. So I always advise, if you are not going to make use of cartridges, make sure you don't leave open the very big canister for a whole night or day, because sometimes you're unlucky, the pressure valve can have opened and all your CO2 would have been gone. So that's both unsafe as well as a very expensive joke. So try to stay away from that. And finally, rotation of the carousel when mounted. We have seen some carousel issues. I will relate to that a little bit later in the presentation, but the carousel is something that's very fragile. So if you start to mechanically use it and start to twist and turn and rotate it, it will have a chance of warping and thus breaking the carousel in the process. I will come back to this issue a little bit later as stated. Then the common issues. I have segmented those in the hardware and software departments. The hardware, the most important ones are the pump failure and the carousel failure. With the pump, you often see that during the boiling or even during the rinsing, you can have dry runs where the pump simply has stopped working. This can have a multitude of reasons, but once this happens, usually there's nothing you can do from your side, and that's why that red triangle pops up and you should contact us. So that is still something I advise you to do, and not, try to put it back on Wi-Fi or shut it off and back on again for like 5 times. You can always try that once, but more than once and it didn't solve it shouldn't be necessary. So try it once and then reach out to us. For the software, it's basically the same. There's not much you can sadly do on your side. It's something that we have to do from our side. These issues are the system are in use. So this is when a session is created. It is still active in our backend, but it's not active on your device. And that gets your system into a stuck state. So this requires intervention from our side. Once this happens and a message shows up, your device is in use by another session, that means reach out to us because there's nothing you can do yourself. Same counts for the device lost its state. Simply you have lost connection or the app will say you can no longer see what's going on with your brew. This usually indicates that there is a loss of state, meaning the keg doesn't know anymore what it's doing, or the base station, but usually the keg. Therefore we have to reload the brewing process on that keg to actually make it work again. These are things we're working on hard to solve and get solved, but sadly they cost time because they are very complicated bugs in our system, and that's why I wanted to alert you that we still have them, and they can occur, and what to do with them when they occur. So that's it for the common issues. Then I would like to move on to the Q&A. I think I can also do that with voice actually and face. Let me stop this and actually get back to my meeting. Stop sharing. Okay. And my camera should be on now, if you hadn't seen me before. Quickly have a drink. Let's see. Back to the presentation. So I have divided it into feature requests and some more general questions, and there's some space for other questions as well. First of all, I got a question about dummy recipes. This basically means that people still find the change from just brewing brew packs to actual a self-created recipe a large step. So there was a request to actually create dummy recipes where it's basically a very easy recipe that shows you the basics of what a good recipe should look like. So this is something we are thinking of as well. There's also a link which I believe Vince shared at brewmates.com, which already has some dummy recipes in there, but it's also something we would like to provide in the future. Then there was another feature request about the future actions. This means that when you are brewing, for example, or fermenting, you can actually see not just one step ahead, but multiple steps ahead of what actually your brew will be looking like. This gives people more insight in when they, for example, can go for a holiday or, I don't know, enjoy their weekend and have a few days away, without having to worry that a lot of actions pop up in between. So that is something we will be providing in the future as well, so that people have more insights in what to expect from their brew if they didn't make it themselves, for example, in the first place, or if they made it themselves as well. So this counts for both brew packs as well as self-made recipes. Then there's also a question about the hop drop times. We have seen that with the Carousel, not always all hop bags drop. This is an issue that we are aware of and also still trying to fix. But luckily, a lot of bright minds have come with the solution to add like metal balls and different kind of bags already that should guarantee a safe dropping of the bags. But by actually providing the hop drop times, people can still intervene when it's necessary, so that a brew is not lost or hops are not added at all at the end of a brew. Let's see. Then we have the Android app. This is probably something a lot of people are actually curious of. The Android app, it is actually something that is very time consuming to develop. So to be very open and clear to you, it is something that is still in the back of our minds, and we're working out ways how to get this released as soon as possible. But honestly, and also looking towards our engineers, software engineers, it is something we don't expect in Q3. It will be more like Q4. So maybe end Q3 to Q4. If we have the time to develop, we expect to at least need like 4 to 6 months to make that realizable, simply because we don't have the luxury anymore of 6 software developers that were working on the software 40 hours a week. Now we only have Dennis really and a lot of other partners, but it goes a little bit slower, and obviously Dennis is also distracted now and then. So that's why, unfortunately, the Android app has not been released yet. Something that we want to cover and is currently in beta is currently people without an iPhone, they also cannot brew packs because there is no QR code scan function on the portal. So that is also something we are going to release so that people can always brew packs even when they don't have an iPhone or other Apple device, or iOS device I should say, so that people are not obliged to also purchase an iOS product next to our machine. So this makes it basically able for people to also brew packs without having an iOS device. Then there are 2 questions that are basically related, the hop spider and the hop stand. Currently, we have something in place in the recipe creation where you have to have so many trip removals, like I mentioned, because you add an X amount of hops, dry hops, during the fermentation. But if people use a hop spider, for example, this means that they don't have to have all those trip removals, so they have to fake it. That is something we also think is a waste of time, so that's something we want to change in the future. As well as the hop stand, that's a little bit more difficult to integrate because it will be a completely new step that will be added to our state machine. So basically the way of all the steps and how they are aligned together. But this should enable people to give them some sort of a whirlpool effect. And a whirlpool effect is basically dropping in hops at the end of your boiling to cooling phase, so that hops will only give off aromatic flavors instead of bitterness. So this is something we are thinking of as well and want to release in the future. But unfortunately not a real timeline yet either. Although we expect that it can be something that's eventually short term. Let's see what else is there. Onto the questions about the logging mechanism. I have to look up this issue real quick from this is about the logs and how they are basically presented in the portal. So sometimes you have that the logs aren't displayed correctly, and we are working on a way now to change the way of how we handle the logs, so that you don't have the issues anymore with very old graphs or graphs that show very odd values or cannot load old data anymore, to make the logging way more frequently. But that is again something that takes time. It takes time to change the whole mechanism of how we log now to a different kind of logging system. I would say if other people have questions, you can send them in the chat, and then I will handle them one by one. First of all, I want to thank you though for your attention, and I hope everything was clear. And again, apologies for the late start, but luckily everybody was able to join. So if you have any questions, put them in the chat, and then you can also ask them in voice if you want when I give the word to you. Okay. Is it possible to get notifications from the web portal just like using the app? At the moment, it isn't. Like on the portal, you do get some. Oh, let me allow this guy. So it is still possible when you're on your laptop, obviously, to see a push notification, but that's only when you're obviously in the actual portal. So this is something I will put on the list, and yeah, I hope that Dennis has an answer to that eventually, but I cannot give an answer to that now. I feel like though that should be something that is a minor extra step, but maybe I'm completely wrong because I'm not a software developer after all. Um, yeah, Patrick, a question about the ice spindle kind of device. MiniBrew has been working on a device that's called the G-Buoy. It's a device that basically measures your sugar percentage and tracks your fermentation during the fermentation. This is something we already have advanced developments in, but actually to make this a realizable hardware product, I think it still will take several months, because one thing that needs to be done is actually fine-tuning the graph and the calculation, so making sure that the calculations that are done by this device are actually accurate, as well as the fact that it needs to be sourced. So actually making this device and sourcing all the materials and everything, it takes time. So that's why I'm saying I expect that not to happen within the first, Q1, Q2 either. I expect more like Q3, Q4, so end of this year, if that is something that a lot of people indeed will be requesting. But personally, it is something I would really like, because it gives you a lot of insights in how your fermentation is going, and it gives you even more information on how to direct your brew, the brew after. Let's see. Dave, should the carousel always reset to 0 after a hop drop? Yes. The default setting of the carousel is the 0 position. So this is the position where the little opening in that carousel plate is connected to that yellow pin that's sticking out. So once a carousel turns to 3, it has to turn back to 0. Once it goes to 6, it has to go back to 0 again. If it is not, please let us know and obtain as much information as you can, because this may indicate either that sometimes you have issues with stuck hopbacks, or that the hopbacks don't drop at all, or simply the carousel can be a defect. Like I said, it can be warped, and that can cause the issues. Let's see. How is MiniBrew doing from the business point of view? Do you have any plans to expand the system? And how about entering new EU markets? Business point of view, to keep it short, personally, we're doing really great in terms of where we came from last year. It's almost a year ago now that we got into the financial troubles. But seeing where we are at now, the only thing that is holding us back at this moment is actually the amount of staff that we have. So we would like to actually expand, but for that we need people and eventually budget. But that's why, we just keep on going, keep up the sales. A new production run is coming in May. We're doing actually really good on that. A lot of the pre-orders already have been sold, and we expect to have the majority sold before the new batch even arrives in the Netherlands. So that, gives me a lot of confidence in the future, and also to get into new markets in the EU. And also out of experience, I have seen that lately a lot of people from all around the world, from Greece to Swiss, Hungary, Canada, even people in Africa and Brazil that have reached out to us and wanted to purchase our machine. So hopefully a lot of it will also go automatically, and that is also like almost free marketing. So we get a lot of brand exposure, and that will get us to the next level. So there's no real timeline yet, but it is something that we are also really willing to attack new markets basically. Let's see. Remco, for doing a double mash, it would be great in recipe creation to copy the first mash stage to the second. Is this feasible? That is something I will write down. Give me a moment, because it obviously saves you time, and I would assume it's not too big of a deal. Let's see, copy double mash. So I think this is something that we can actually release at some point. I don't think it requires too much attention. Although then again, it all depends on where in the whole pipeline it ends up. If it's something that's really urgent, it will end up here. But knowing with all the stuff that we want to develop, like that hop stand or the hops drops, those are all things that have priority now over this, for example. So I hope that answered your question. Also, if I didn't answer your question yet, you can let me know in the chat, or if you need some more info. But I think I did so far.
For me, this was an answer, yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Remco. Let's see, Victor. At the moment, you need a pro account if you want to brew Brewpack, if you don't have an iOS device. So you can only use Brewpack, so non. So basically asking if you can use the portal without actually having pro access. This is something we have been thinking of, and a decision hasn't been made yet. But we do feel like that the portal is such a unique and helpful feature for a lot of people. That is something that we are considering. And also we are considering to maybe give people like a tryout or like a demo to use the portal. So maybe that is something that go hand in hand. That if you have the portal, you get the first feeling of what it is like to actually what recipe creation basically means. But not really go into the depth of all the bits and pieces and the parameters that you need to be aware of when actually creating a recipe. So this is possibly something that we will also be looking out for, because this is something that has been on the back of our minds for a while now. Are there any other questions? Let's see. Martin Vasen. Wait, let me check. Maybe I've missed people. Oh yeah, Chris Hannes. Are there any plans for future masterclass with specific subjects more in details? If people have a lot of like requests about certain topics, I think this is definitely something that we can do. I see a lot of positive responses now already, despite the rough start. But yeah, I would be happy to give some insights. Obviously, it takes some time to prepare a meeting, so it's something that has to fit in your schedule. But I also get a lot of energy of sharing my knowledge with you and vice versa, because I always learn from the questions that are asked as well in these sessions. So if there are like specific topics, maybe I will host a poll at some point, and people can, give their preference to actually host more master classes in the future. Because this again is something that was more meant for beginners, as you can see. So maybe something for the more advanced users as well. That is something I can definitely do. Hopefully that answered your question, Chris. Then Martin. any plans for kind of MiniBrew brewery event? Yes, obviously COVID is still a bit of a pain in the butt, as we all know. I think eventually this is something that will definitely pop up. We used to be on events a lot before COVID and the whole reorganization of MiniBrew took place. So we definitely do miss the connection with the customers a little bit. But maybe it would be awesome if we could perhaps create some kind of a championship in creating the best beer and then drink that chosen beer on a specific date, or maybe just have a barbecue with the whole MiniBrew community. It's something that we can consider. I will pick that up with the team and see what we can do there. But obviously, COVID is still something I can blame it on. But yeah, I'd be happy to meet you guys in real life at some point. Patrick again, the business update mentioned also working is being done on the keg, redesign and Peltier. So there are some changes on the keg. We are using a different kind of isolating, basically some kind of gel. The idea is that the Peltier, between the Peltier and the actual keg, there's some kind of a gel that improves the cooling capacity. So that is something that is going to be in the new version. But the most important things that we want to change for the keg are especially the tap. And perhaps Frederick has been doing tests with insulation of the trip container, so I will also be going to perform tests with that to see if there's also something we can support. So the focus is now more on the accessories from the keg, like the tap, which personally I think can really improve the quality of the beer, simply because of the regulated flow. But cooling wise, at this point that it is such a huge intervention to basically meaning you have to redesign the keg to get like a possibility of cooling to like 0 degrees. That means a lot of effort. So I think honestly it will be minor things and tweaks, like perhaps making extra sensors in the keg that can read off all of the parameters, and it's the temperature is not just regulated on one position, but for example on 3. Those are all things that we can think of in the future. But I think it's more towards those like little things instead of the big things, because that means our whole cooling mechanism has to be turned around, and that's a huge investment from our side. Let's see. MG guest. Thanks for the presentation. Where can we see edit the ingredients that the portal knows and yields, etc.? That's actually a very good question. Let me check real quickly. So that is also something we have been thinking of. There is currently not a really one place where you can see all the ingredients that you actually have added at some point. So that is actually a very good point. That is something we should integrate. But yield, like when you are creating a new ingredient, depending on where you get your ingredient, but usually malts, the malt supplier has to provide you with the extract potential, moisture, basically the things that you need to actually create that ingredient in your portal. Same counts for the hops. It will also always tell you what the alpha acid count is of your hops, and that is the vital thing to know about your hops. So usually you can always reach out to the provider of your ingredients, and that should provide you with the necessary information. But like you said, it would be useful, I think, to have a sort of archive where you can see all the ingredients that you have added. let's see. Zugas, sorry if I pronounce your name not perfectly. Oh, he left actually, I see. Did he rejoin? Well, I'll answer his question anyway. If there's going to be a 10 or 20 liter mini brew system, that is something, that is not yet, how should I say it, on the planning, because it's such a huge shift to what we're working with right now and the size of the team we have, that it is something that will be, I think, only released in a few years. But that obviously depends again. Let's say a huge investor shows up and we get a lot of funds to realize those kind of things. That speeds up the process tons. So it depends on money in that case, to be very honest with you. Chris, thanks for your addition. It's indeed the thermal conductor paste. Let's see, Ellen. Yeah, Ellen, thanks for your kind words. I love to see the good responses from everybody. So I hope it is something that we can make happen more often. Not just the monthly updates that we give, but also something face to face. Gives you a little bit more confidence, maybe in the whole development of everything as well. Vince, the lead button, I will write that down as well for the ingredients. Okay. Because that's not on the planning yet, as far as I know, Vince. So I've written that down. After Chris, Hannes, control the keg completely yourself as a standalone keg from 5 to 25 degrees. No warnings, all just in your hands. I have to say this is something I don't know how it exactly works. I know that normally you first need an actual recipe from the base to start something on the keg, and cannot do it without, I believe. But
what I mean is here, after you did your brew and your cooling finished, that from that moment on you take completely control yourself. So you don't use a recipe anymore. Recipe just has nothing anymore, and that we just decide ourselves. Okay, now I do the primary fermentation at 20 degrees for.
I understand. Yeah, this is something we have been thinking of. This is basically the pushing to serving. Mm-hmm. We have been thinking of actually making a button that enables you to push to serving, especially because if people experience issues during, let's say, the weekend, and at this point we are still not really available at that time, you can intervene yourself. So that is definitely something that is in the pipeline. Yeah.
Good to hear.
Let's see. Go. Okay. Any more questions? It looks like I've gone through them. And a little bit over time, but I'm glad you guys are still around. Oh, new messages. Is it loading? Well, if there are no more questions, then thank you a lot for joining. Like I said, it gives me a lot of energy to also see all the feedback that you guys give and all the experience you conduct yourself. Because, it simply is so useful for me to not do everything on my own and also get a little bit of a hand from you guys. So thanks a lot. And hopefully future sessions will follow, but I'm sure they will.